we doing up there? Are we ready to go, Eric? All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because we're going to end a half hour earlier than normal. Just as a reminder, we're going to end at 7:30. I've got to go downstairs for grief share. Had a great conversation this morning. They have a morning and an evening session, and lots of questions. It's a chance for them to ask questions to me like I know what I'm talking about. But questions that people have about death and dying and grief and heaven and all of these things. So it's really, really interesting. So I'll be doing a little bit of code switching, right? We'll go from talking about world religions, and then I'll go down there and I'll start talking about Christianity and the ways in which we work through grief. So that's the kind of stuff that makes my brain tired, but it's really good stuff. It's really good stuff. So let me pray for us, and then we'll get started. So God, we thank you for this chance to come together, chance to be able to learn a little bit more about you, about this world, about the ways in which people have tried to understand the world and tried to understand your divinity and tried to understand just the things that make us feel small and that make you seem so big. So God, we ask that you would just be with us tonight, help us to learn a little bit, to grow a little bit, and to learn to love our neighbors a little bit better. And we give you all the praise and thanks. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. So tonight, we're going to be talking about Buddhism. If you were here with us last week, we talked about Hinduism. Hinduism and Buddhism are mildly related, okay? In the same ways that you might say, in some way, shapes, or form, that Judaism and Christianity are related, or that Christianity and Islam are related. That there are some things that are held in common. For instance, talk about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We're talking about Abrahamic religions, right? We're talking about similar origin stories, similar terminology, maybe. In the same way, Hinduism and Buddhism are going to do that. Now, here's where I am failing you entirely. We're going to talk about Buddhism today, and it kind of comes out of Hinduism. We're not going to talk about Confucianism. We're not going to talk about Taoism. We're not going to talk about Jainism. And so on and so on and so on. There are a lot of kind of offshoots of Eastern religion that we're just not going to have time to cover. It would take a really, really long time to cover all these. And they're important. They encompass a large amount of the world's population, okay? So they're not unimportant. But I feel like if I'm giving you Hinduism and I'm giving you Buddhism, that you're going to be able to make some inferences about some of these other kind of offshoots and hopefully have a little bit of a basis of understanding of how you can go about studying some of these things on your own. Next week is going to be our last week together. We're going to talk about a hodgepodge of things. Bring your questions. Feel free to bring, if you've got a little thing. I already know we're going to have a little bit of talk about Diwali, one of the Hindu holidays that we didn't get a chance to really dive into last week. We're going to hear a little bit more about that. And I'm also going to address some of the other ones that you might be more familiar with next week. Some things like atheism, Mormonism, those kinds of things. We're gonna touch on a few of those. But today, Buddhism. All right, you guys ready for this? Here we go. Buddhism is I don't want to say barely. That's the wrong word. Buddhism is a different kind of religion in that it's non-theistic. There's not necessarily a deity involved, okay? Now, when we think about religion, that's normally what we think of, right? We think about, well, there's a God, there's a deity, there's some sort of divine being that exists that is a part of this religion. And that's just really not the case with Buddhism. Now, when you get into a couple of different branches of Buddhism that we'll talk about later on, there is a belief in some deities, but they are not the central focus of the religion itself. Okay, the religion itself talks about something else. It comes out of Hinduism. We're going to be talking about the Buddha here in just a little bit. The Buddha was born a Hindu. he would have said that he died a Hindu in all likelihood, okay? He would have not separated those two things necessarily. Now, since they have become pretty distinct from one another, some of the terminology is going to be the same. The Hindu faith today, most Hindus today would say Buddhism is just another branch of Hinduism. Like we buy into all this. And they would actually say that the Buddha is the reincarnation of, I think it's Vishnu, one of their gods, or an avatar of one of their gods, like the human form of one of their gods. So they would say, yeah, this all, like, we get this. This all matches us. It's all similar. It all works together. But it's pretty distinct today. It's pretty in most understandings. Most people who follow Buddhism would say, yeah, we're Buddhists. We're not Hindus. Also, we're this. And most would say that there is a certain classification, just like in Christianity. We've got different denominations, right? And there's something similar to denominations in Buddhism. There's 3 main branches, and then within each branch, there's different schools, is what they would call them, schools, not necessarily denominations, but schools that follow different teachers. So we'll dive into that a little bit more later, but that's just Buddhism at a 10,000-foot view. But to talk about Buddhism, who do you have to talk about? You got to talk about Buddha, right? You got to talk about the Buddha. The Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama is the name of the Buddha, the first Buddha, although maybe not the first Buddha. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Born around 563 BC, died around 583 BC. So for reference, okay, this is around the end of the Old Testament period that you have written down, okay? Towards the end of the book of Malachi, you've got this, okay? This is what's going on after the Jews are coming out of the Babylonian exile. This is happening somewhere else in the world. The Buddha is said to have been born near the border of India and Nepal. What's near the border of India and Nepal? Anybody know? There's something really big there. Yeah, the Himalayan mountains, okay? So at the base of the Himalayan mountains. Seems like a very spiritual kind of place, doesn't it? Said to have had a miraculous birth. So here, tell me if you hear any things that sound similar. There's some things that are going to sound different. Mother was not born out of sexual intercourse. Mom was a virgin. Okay? A white elephant carrying a lotus flower entered his mother's womb during a dream. And then he was born out of her side, and not out of a natural birth. So there's like some things going on there. There was also a prophet of sorts. We would call it a prophet. It was a great teacher, a Hindu teacher who was around that told the father that this is going to be a great political or spiritual leader. And we'll really kind of see what happens there. Political leader as long as he never leaves his home. Great political leader as long as he never leaves his home. So his father actually kept him locked in a palace. It's like some sort of crazy Disney movie where you like lock the kid in the palace in hopes that they become a thing or to keep them from everything else. But he's thought to have been a great being who had actually been born many times previously and took birth on earth once again through reincarnation, right? On earth once again out of compassion for all the suffering beings on earth. So he's like, out of compassion, oh, this happened again. So he was born again, reincarnated again into this child. And this is going to be a theme throughout Buddhism, right? So the story goes that Siddhartha is born. Father hears this story. Father's a wealthy landowner, wants his son to be a great ruler and not go off and like start another religion, which were the two options that were given him by the prophet. So he keeps him there, and he gives him the best of everything so that he'll never want to leave. He gives him the best food, the best drink, During the rainy season, just stay inside. I'll bring in women to dance. I'll give you the best of foods, the best of everything. Here's your really pretty cousin. You get to marry her. And so that's great for him. And all of this goes really well till he's about 29 years old. And his father finally begs his father, he's like, listen, can I just go outside the walls just like once maybe? And his father's finally like, look, I've got you to 29. What mischief could you get in at this point in time? Obviously, we'll be fine. So he goes, and he actually takes 4 trips outside of the walls. The first time he goes, and he had been kept from these things his whole life, okay? He had never seen a flower wilt. He had never seen a person get sick. He had never seen somebody get old. He'd never seen somebody die, any of those things. He didn't understand mortality, okay? And so he goes outside the walls. The first time he goes out, he sees a really, really old guy. And he asks the servant who goes out with him, what's going on over here? And the servant says, well, yeah, everybody gets old. And he's like, did not know that. That's new information for me. Goes out again a little bit later on and sees a guy who's really, really sick. Why is this? What's wrong with this guy? I guess it's, well, he's sick. What does that mean? Like, well, everybody gets sick. Didn't know that. That's new information. Didn't know people got sick. His third time out, he sees a corpse. What's going on? Well, everybody dies. We all die. And he's just like broken. He doesn't know what to do with this information. People get old, they get sick, they die. It's terrible. And he's like he goes back in to his cousin wife. He's really sad, doesn't know what's going on. He's got a kid, but he's just like hurting it. This does not feel right? There's something that's really a mess inside of him. He goes out a 4th time. And the 4th time he goes out, he encounters a monk. It's a Hindu monk who is meditating and who's searching for lasting happiness and trying to find the way to this kind of peace. And he says, that's the thing. That's what I need to do. So he renounces his royal life. He's got the best of everything. He's got the finest of everything. He's got everything, right? And he starts practicing self-denial. He finds this group of monks, and they are extreme monks. Like, we're talking 40-day fast kind of monks. You sit down and you meditate under a tree. You only eat what happens to fall in your lap out of the tree. Like, that's what you get. And this extreme meditation and all of these things. And he's trying this, but he ends up getting, after like 6 years he's trying this, he gets disillusioned. He's like, this is not working. And so he breaks his fast with some rice milk, just like a spoonful of rice milk. And all the other monks go, oh, how dare you? And I can't believe you would indulge in such a way. But he's like, there's got to be something else. And he finds it, and he calls it the middle way. That there's something between all the self-indulgence of his previous life and the self-denial he's been doing, this extreme fasting. There's got to be a middle way to all of this. It has something to do with deep meditation. He knows that. So he's looking for this awakening or enlightenment. And so he goes and he sits down under this fig tree that's known today as the Bodhi tree. And that's a picture of it. It's a 1,500-year-old tree, I guess. And he goes and he sits down under it, right? This diamond throne wasn't there when he went and sat down, but it's there now. But that's where he sat. And he started meditating, and he achieved enlightenment. And this is where he became the Buddha. Okay, this is where he went from being just a guy who is seeking to the Buddha, or the awakened one. He's awakened, right? He gets it. He goes back to those monks that he had been with before, and he gets a few of them to follow his teachings, the Sangha, They become this monastic order that develops from his early disciples. And so there's monks and there's nuns. So bhikshus and bhikshunis. So there's guys and girls from the very beginning. Women can become enlightened just as easy as men can become enlightened. Now, the Buddha dies around 80 years of age, okay? But he's talked about this already. Remember, they've got a lot of Hinduism in there, and one of the main tenets of Hinduism is the idea of reincarnation, right? So, yeah, he dies at 80, but does he? But does he really? So he says this, that the true Buddha is not a human body, it's enlightenment, right? A human body must die, but wisdom of enlightenment will exist forever in the truth of Dharma and the practice of Dharma. And we'll get to that in just a second. So he's basically already setting the stage a little bit for, like, yeah, I'm going away, but this isn't really the end. Kind of Jesus-y, right? A little bit Jesus-y, but Jesus would be later on. But kind of a similar kind of concept that I'm going away, but I'll be back somehow, okay? So Dharma, he talks about the truth of Dharma. Dharma, we talked about Dharma a little bit in Hinduism, a little bit different understanding of it in Buddhism. Dharma is the teachings of Buddha. Dharma in Hinduism is you have to live your right Dharma. You have to fit into your who you are, who you were created to be. In Buddhism, Dharma is follow the teachings of Buddha, of the awakened one, of the enlightened one. That's what your Dharma is. That's what everyone's Dharma is to follow the teachings of the Buddha. And Dharma is a guide to the farther shore or nirvana. Nirvana is the goal. Nirvana is liberation. Nirvana is getting out of this cycle of reincarnation and being freed from it, okay? Interestingly, here's where it's very different from Christianity, okay? So in Christianity, what's the goal after you die? Anybody? Heaven, right? Thank you. I'm glad someone here knows that. Yeah, heaven, right? That's the idea, that we are in Christ, and so that we end up in paradise with Jesus. In Buddhism, it's different. Nirvana is essentially saying, this is your being freed from this cycle of suffering and pain and all of these things, and it's just bliss and peace, and you're just out of the cycle. Okay, it's not necessarily that you go to a place. It's basically that your spirit, soul, however you want to talk about it, is broken from the cycle of all of these things. So it's a little bit of a different understanding. So how do you go about getting there? Well, he's got some paths. This guy, Buddha, did a great job of, so before these things were being written down, okay, understand the way that he's coming to these things and passing them on is through meditation. So he does a lot of coming up with numbered lists of things to think about. Very easy to remember kind of things to think about. So he starts off with the basis of Buddhism is the Four Noble Truths. These are the four truths that you need to know. It doesn't start off great. It gets a little better. But truth number one, there's pain and suffering in the world. Like, don't try to pretend there's not. There is. There's pain and suffering in the world. That is just a part of the truth of what it means to be, what it means to exist, that there's pain and suffering. Number two is that the way pain arises is your fault, essentially. It's because of our craving or our clinging or our desire for things, and we're ignorant of the fact that everything that we are after is just temporal. It's all meaningless kind of stuff, right? Like, I have pain and suffering because I love beautiful sunny days, but it's gonna rain eventually, right? I have pain and suffering because I want this job, but eventually I'm going to become too old for this job, or somebody else is going to get the job. Eventually, something's going to happen, and something bad's going to happen with it, right? I have pain or I have suffering because I love this dog, but that dog's going to die, right? Like, it's just, like, why get a dog? It's going to die, right? It's this terrible thing. So that's kind of what he's saying. Is like, look, these are temporal things that we're falling in love with, that we're aspiring to, that we're craving. And he says that the remedy is coming to the realization of three marks of existence, right? Number one, that there is suffering. Number two, everything's impermanent. And number three, by the way, yourself, you're not even real. You're impermanent. The self doesn't even really exist other than to exist in this cycle of suffering. But ultimately, the goal of the self is nirvana, and to get out of all of this mess is to get out of this. So stop tying yourself down to all of these other things, right? That's what he's saying. So get out of that cycle. So the third of the noble truths is that there can be cessation of pain, that this can happen, that you don't have to live in this cycle forever and ever. Now, to get cessation of pain, it means you have to come to full realization of these things. You have to realize all of this stuff. And then he says that the fourth noble truth is that there is a path to end this pain. There's a path to do this. And it's a noble eightfold path. So there's more numbered lists. Here we go. All right. So how do we get there? How do we end up on this noble eightfold path to liberation? Here's what he says. First, you got to understand the four noble truths, right understanding, okay? Second is you have to have right thoughts or motives. Not egotistical, not selfish or hiding your imperfections. As you're talking with people, you're not trying to put on a face. You're just being very real. We would call it being very real with people. You're being very real about yourself. You're being very realistic about yourself. Here are the places I fall short. Here are the places you fall short. We're just going to be real about all of this and not try to hide all of these things, not try to build ourselves up or hide our imperfections. Number three, we have to have right speech. You're never going to achieve liberation if you've got some sort of, your speech is in some way tearing other people down or trying to build yourself up in ways that aren't valid or true. We've got to be honest about things. Number four is you've got to have right action. Guess what? Right action, it's got another list. And this is kind of akin to our 10 commandments. They have the 5 precepts, okay? Their 5 precepts are no killing, no stealing, no sexual misconduct, no lying, no intoxicants, okay? So not too far off from our 10 commandments. We got a couple of different ones, and they're missing some of ours, but mostly, okay, these are some basic kind of understanding. So we're through 4 of the ways to this path of liberation. You've got to do these 4 things. Here's the next 4. Right livelihood. Your vocation, your work, your job can't be something that causes you to violate the 5 precepts. So you can't have a job that causes you to kill. So being a soldier would be really hard, right? You can't have a job that causes you to steal in some way. So, any job where you're having to be a little bit, deceptive towards others, sexual misconduct, lying, intoxicants, probably can't work in a bar, any of that kind of stuff. So, you've got to have a job that is legitimate and noble. Right effort. You're cultivating wholesome actions. You're trying every day to have more wholesome and good kinds of actions. And then these last 2 are very specific to Buddhism. Right mindfulness, right? Kind of awareness of what's going on around you, being very real and present and in the moment. And then right meditation, which is a mental discipline of being able to help focus yourself on some of these things. So this is the noble eightfold path that leads you towards liberation and getting out of this cycle. There's a name for the cycle. It's kind of a westernized name for it, but it's the wheel of birth and death. The wheel of birth and death, it kind of symbolizes, again, remember last week we talked about how in Hinduism, life isn't a timeline, it's cyclical, right? And kind of in the same way, this is cyclical. Karma, we talked about that last week a little bit. It's a spiritual cause and effect kind of thing that leads you one way or another. The action of body, of speech, of mind, of the way that you are is going to build up good karma or bad karma. And the wheel operates on kind of this, the three root afflictions, the three things that they've said, these are the three main causes of like bad karma. There's greed or attachment, right? There's hatred and aversion, and there's delusion or ignorance. So like not being willing to learn. So you're going to hear in Buddhism all the time, there's a huge part of Buddhism is in being willing to give monetarily, especially give your possessions away to others. Another big part of it is peace and the work towards peace, like actively working towards peace. And then a third part is like we're going to learn, we're going to study, we're going to dive into this stuff, and you've got to do all these things. If you don't do these things, like that's like what's right at the center of everything bad about the world, right? So this whole cycle, this whole wheel, this cycle of existence is called samsara. The goal is to get out of samsara. And so there's another very important word, and it's bodhisattva. I'm probably butchered that, but that. And it's a person, essentially, who becomes a teacher or a Buddha, an awakened person who, out of their own benevolence, allows themselves, even though they've achieved the ability to get out of this, even though they've achieved awakening or nirvana, out of their own benevolence says, you know what, I'll come on back. I'll get reincarnated again to help out the people who are hurting, the people who don't get it yet. I'll allow myself to be reincarnated so I can come back and teach again. And so these become very, very important and are important to this day, and we'll get to these towards the end, but very, very important. So this is a little bit of, and feel free to stop. I'm going kind of fast tonight. I'm sorry, because I've got 2/3 of the time that I normally have. So I want to get this stuff for you. But this is the wheel of life. This is what it looks like. Isn't that inviting? So what you see is in the middle, you have these three factors that are like the problems, like the core problems. Do you remember what those are? They are the attachment, greed, aversion, and hatred, delusion, and ignorance. So you kind of see those symbolized here. You see the people at the black background that have bad karma, white background, good karma. And then the idea is like they're just kind of showing a picture of what this looks like. So the third circle represents the spheres of existence, from gods to the infernal regions, all this stuff. Grasping the wheel on the outside is a monster that represents, they don't believe this is like an actual thing, but a monster that represents impermanence and death, right? That everything is meaningless in some ways. We're going to get to that in a minute, because I think that there's some things that tie into our scriptures a little bit. So what you're hoping for is nirvana, extinguishing the cycle of samsara. I want to get out. You want to be an arhat, a worthy one who has found enlightenment in this life. In one of their writings, it talks about it this way. There's no more, and so just hear this, because this is super interesting to me. This is what the goal is, right? No suffering for him who is free from sorrow, free from the fetters of life, free in everything he does. He has reached the end of his road. Like a bird invisibly flying in the sky, he lives without possessions, knowledge of his food, freedom is world, while others wonder. He has found freedom, peaceful is his thinking, peaceful his speech, peaceful his deed, tranquil his mind. In other words, like I'm going for like just the nothingness. Like, which is what I think some people in Western culture fear. Like I think we fear that that's what could be at the end. It's like that it's nothingness. And he's saying, no, you're trying to get out of the cycle of terrible things and get to that nothingness. And we're hoping for not nothingness, but something greater than. Right? So it's a little bit of a different concept. Now theirs is more of a, it's just you're at peace. Just your body, your life, your soul's at peace. So a little bit different of an understanding. So Buddhism spreads. So King Ashoka is a lot like, if you want to liken him to something, King Ashoka is similar to our Emperor Constantine. Okay? Emperor Constantine is the reason Christianity spread so much. Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. For Buddhism, because of King Ashoka, Buddhism spreads. He was a powerful Indian king, felt remorse for the wars that he had waged, so he became a Buddhist, and he began to spread Buddhism. Out of that came some different branches of Buddhism, two main ones, and then a third that we'll get to. So Theravada is kind of the way of the elders. Those are the areas where you find it most often. It is very monastic. It is very formalized. It is the old school. This is old school Buddhism, okay? Mahayana, which means a great vehicle, is probably the one you've seen most often. It's much more popularized, and it's probably the one that you've experienced at some point in time. So for Theravada, the one that's a little bit more monastic in some ways, they still go by the Pali canon. Pali is an older language, an older Indian language that is still read in. It means the three baskets, because there were three reed baskets that is originally found in. And that's how they collected their ancient scriptures. Has a lot of rules for discipline, dharmic teachings, and all those kind of things. And they talk about the triple gem. Again, this feels in some ways a little bit like Trinitarian in some way, shape, or form, but it's a little bit different. So they say there's three ways that we kind of practice our faith, three things that kind of teach us. One is the Buddha. We don't pray to the Buddha. We don't worship the Buddha. We don't believe the Buddha is a god, but we honor Buddha as a model for how we are meant to live our lives. The second way we kind of understand our faith is through the Dharma, which are the teachings of the Buddha. So the teachings in the Buddha himself are both held in very high esteem. And then the Sangha, there's something about the community of monks and nuns that are meant to be a way in which we learn to live our faith. Right? So these are the three main ways that you live out your faith. Very big into meditation. So it's kind of a twofold thing. There's this, you calm yourself, samatha, you calm yourself, and really, concentrate on your breathing, all of those things. Then after you get yourself to that level of calm, that's when you look for vipassana, or insight. That's where I get myself to this, and then I'm looking for this. They're in their devotional practices, a lot of veneration and respect for Buddha, again, not praying to Buddha. They are non-theistic. They wouldn't say that there are gods controlling things. Say, no, this is just about this way of living. Now they do, in some of the places where Buddha was cremated after he died, and his ashes were spread in all these different areas. In a lot of different areas they were spread. They would build these stupas or mounds. I forgot to plug this in maybe. They would build these mounds where they would come to venerate relics. Has anyone ever been to Maria Stein, Ohio? Anybody know where I'm talking about? So in Maria Stein, there is a Catholic church, kind of in the middle of nowhere. If you go in that Catholic church, there's the second largest collection of relics, I think, in the United States. 200 some bones of different saints and things of that nature. It's fascinating stuff. They have little wax seals that say they're official from the Vatican. I mean, just incredible. I think like a part of the skull of Saint Valentine is there. And there's like all sorts of other just wild. There's some female saint whose name I'm not even going to try to remember, but like her whole body is there, like encased in wax or something. And so they go there not to pray necessarily to these things, but there's a veneration aspect to it. There's something about being close to the actual physical remains of the body of a saint that feels special or important. So in a similar manner, they will have relics of the Buddha in some of these different places. Maybe it's not his body or his ashes, but maybe this is the cup he drank from. This is the blah, 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 whatever. And there's something about being close to that helps them feel closer to the oneness they are meant to experience with the world. So it helps them to kind of focus in those ways. And so there are some of these places. That's a big part of Theravada. And Mahayana, it's a little bit different, okay? So maybe think of Theravada as more like, if you want to go Catholic Protestant, that's probably our closest relationship to what's going on there. It's not a perfect correlation, but just to kind of get your mind around it. Mahayana is probably a little bit less, stringent or strict in some of those things. But they are very big into the Bodhisattva, who are the enlightened ones who are reincarnating themselves to come back. And so they kind of look at Buddha in some different ways. There's the formless body of who Buddha was. There's the bliss body, like this idea of what the Buddha was in his most enlightened moment that you're striving for. But then you're also kind of venerating the Buddha in Buddha's reincarnated forms in different ways. There's also this big push towards, like, the main ideal is where when I ask people, like, why do you go to church? What do you want to get from church? The thing I hear most often from people is like, yeah, I'm coming every Sunday to get filled up. Like, I just want to get, filled with, I recharge my batteries, all these things. It's like the opposite thing here, okay? Emptiness, right? Everything is empty. I'm trying to get this stuff out. I'm trying to get everything out, right? I don't want that. Which is similar to, do you remember in the book of Ecclesiastes, what does Solomon say in Ecclesiastes? Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. There's nothing new under the sun. I hate everything. I've tried riches and all this. There's nothing. None of it matters, right? It's a little bit similar to some of the ideas of what's happening here. It's trying to rid ourselves from all these vanities, from all these pleasures, from all these things. I'm going to rid myself of this stuff. In East Asia, then different schools start to develop, different ways of understanding. How do you get there? How does this happen? What does this look like? And probably the most famous that you've heard of is Chan or Zen. So Chan is the Chinese version. It eventually moves to Japan, where it becomes Zen Buddhism. And it's means the great way of enlightenment. Here's how you get to enlightenment. There's a lot of focus in Zen Buddhism on meditation, dhyana, meditation. That's how you're going to get there. Remember, there's like this eightfold path. And number 8 was meditation. This is like their main thing. Like, we're going to focus on the meditation. Meditation is a key to the rest of it. So you're going to do that. There's some very specific ways that you should sit to meditate. Very, very elaborate practices for the way that you do this. Specific practices for the way that you do this, called zazen. And it can lead you into these insights. They call it like thusness, which is an anglicized way of saying, it's like, this is the true nature of things. You focus on everything you're doing is what it means. So when I'm mopping, there's nothing else but me and the mop and the floor. And I'm going to focus on this. When I'm making tea, there's nothing else but me and the making of the tea and how I'm putting it in. Like, when you get hyper-focused on these things, it's a form of meditation. and it's known as Kensho. And so we can realize within it our own awakened nature or Buddha nature. We can see that it can be within each and every one of us. In Hinduism, this is where it departs from Hinduism, right? In Hinduism, man, you're going to have to go through cycles and keep climbing your way to the top through rebirth and rebirth and rebirth and everything. In Buddhism, it's like, no, any one of us can attain it in this life. Any one of us can get there to awakening. Koan is another way, as another form of meditation, and it's, I didn't really know how to write it, so I just said attention to mind-boggling questions. Here's the example that's often given. It's, what did your face look like before your mother and father existed? Like, it's just, I don't know. You know, it's like, I don't know. But like you focus on some impossible question and you let your mind try to wrap around it as a form of meditation. And through that, you can gain a satori or a flash of insight. Like, oh, I understood a thing in a way that I've never understood it before. It's more and more awakening and moving towards awakening. This is probably a form of Buddhism that you might have encountered in some way, shape, or form. Most likely, though, even though it's smaller-ish in Eastern cultures, an offshoot of Mahayana that has come a little bit more Western and has become a little bit more famous in Western circles is Vajrayana, or the indestructible path. It's a little bit different. It's a Tibetan form of Buddhism, so way on up in the mountains, right? And their spiritual leader is a guy by the name of the Dalai Lama. You might have heard of the Dalai Lama before. They practice Tatrayana, Tantric Buddhism. It's a rigorous path to nurture and to enlightenment. And like there's these rules for how you go about doing it. They're very into you meditate on your own self, on how you can become one of these great continually reincarnated bodhisattvas. And a lama is a qualified teacher of all of these monks, these people who are trying to learn a little bit more about this. So here's what ends up happening in Tibetan Buddhism, which is how I'm going to refer to this because it's easier to say. So what's happened in Tibetan Buddhism is that this is a newer form that came about around the 7th century or so, AD. Okay, so it's somewhat newer compared to other religions. Buddhism was kind of brought up into Tibet out of, that was mostly Hindu at this point in time. And so they're hearing some more of these new things. And they kind of made it their own in a lot of ways. And a thing that happened was, and the Dalai Lama is a great example, is they got really into this idea of there are certain lamas, certain people who have gained this, who have achieved being a Buddha or a wise teacher, an awakened teacher. And so when this person dies, they end up being reincarnated into someone else. So the Dalai Lama, this is our current Dalai Lama, he is the 14th reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. So what happens is every time a Dalai Lama dies, they put out kind of a search. And other lamas, because there's like a few hundred different kinds of these lamas, of these spiritual teachers, of these gurus, they'll kind of do a little bit of a search and try to figure out, well, where was this soul reincarnated? Where was this person reincarnated to? And they'll get a few, they'll start rounding up a few boys and say, well, it's got to be one of these. And there's some signs, there's some different ways of kind of knowing. One of the things they'll do is they'll put down some of the previous one's possessions in front of them and say, do you recognize any of these? And they're like, yeah, that's my comb. Like, Nope, you didn't have hair, so it's not you. So like, and trying to figure out like who knows what this stuff is. And so eventually you come across about 2 or 3, and then there's a prayer ritual. There's this golden pot that you put some of the names in. You do some prayers, and as long as the central government approves, because the government has gotten very involved in this because they don't want just any schmuck becoming some sort of leader in their community. And so they've got to make sure that they like, nope, not that one. We're gonna negate that one from being, that one's not the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. So they kick that one out. And then they'll pull one and say, yes, this one. So this is the 14th Dalai Lama. So why would that be good? If you believe in reincarnation, that's great. You've already had 13 lifetimes of experience and knowledge that you're bringing along with you. That's pretty great, right? I mean, why start from scratch when you can do this? This makes a lot of sense. But it became, early on, it was very, and it's, the government, actually, this is where the government stepped in and said, we're going to help you guys figure this out. Because what was happening was some pretty rich families were essentially holding proverbial guns to people's heads and saying, hey, my kid's next reincarnation, right? And they're like, yeah, sure, fine. And so it was not good. And so the government kind of stepped in and said, hey, we're going to help you guys kind of come up with a system for what this looks like. But because of that, there's between 3 and 800, depending on what count you go by, between 3 and 800 reincarnated Buddhas, the Dalai Lama being one, in this form of Buddhism. Dalai Lama being the most important. There's others that have some sway, but this is the one that seems to be most important. The Dalai Lama is also known to be, and I'm not even going to try to say this word, but this was a Hindu god. So they have a little bit more. This branch of Buddhism buys in a little bit more to the deity idea. Okay, that there's some relationship with deities. It says, you know what, you are somehow related to one of these gods, and also one of these great teachers of compassion. So the Dalai Lama has a huge bent towards the idea of compassion, of nonviolence. So this Dalai Lama in particular, and here's where you get into some of the political stuff and everything. This particular Dalai Lama was very young, a teenager, when the Dalai Lama is the leader in Tibet, in the region of Tibet. After the 13th Dalai Lama died, the Chinese dynasty saw an opportunity to come into Tibet and to kind of take a little bit more control. He was about 19 years old when he tried to come in and have a conversation with Chairman Mao around, hey, what if China doesn't kill all the people in Tibet? What if we live in peace and harmony and Tibet's its own free area, or we can be a region of China, but you don't, hurt us or unfairly tax us or anything like that. And they had a good conversation, and then he left, and Chairman Mao essentially set off with his head. And he said, well, I'm going to go live in exile in India then, which is what he has done ever since. And so he's not just the religious leader, but he's also the de facto political leader of Tibet, which is an occupied territory of the Republic of China. And it's been a thing since those times, since the 50s, right? So really, really kind of a fascinating system. It would be as if the Pope, like back in history when the Pope was also not just a religious leader, but a political leader, right? Same kind of idea. He's also a political leader in so many ways. So really interesting, and that's probably the biggest thing going on in Buddhism today. It will be interesting, He's in his 80s. I don't know exactly how old he is. I know he's in his 80s. He had his 80th birthday party in New York City, so I know that. But because he can't go to Tibet, so he's in New York. And but a huge advocate of peace and of all of these things. When he dies, it will lead to a political issue in that region. And it'll just be interesting to see how all of that happens. But even though it's a part of a religion, it's a political thing as well. So, present day, Buddhists would say that are very socially engaged. That's one of the biggest things that you hear around Buddhism today, is that there's, these are a couple of great Buddhist monks or Buddhas, who even recently have spoken out against both capitalism and communism. Han was huge in Vietnam around the times of the wars, and was really working towards peace and ceasefires and things of those nature. Buddha said, this is a quote from the original Buddha, hatred is never appeased by hatred, it's appeased by love. And this is one of their big tenets, that we've got to have compassion for one another. Nonviolence is a way towards that. Lots of different monastic projects that are happening now through the monasteries, a lot of works towards peace and those kind of things, and a lot of different social movements kind of around that. So those are some of the biggest things that are going on in Buddhism today, is a lot of work towards peace and nonviolence. That's why a lot of this is caught on in Western culture. A lot of these, especially I would say the non-theistic pieces, the pieces that don't deal with deities and things of that nature, but just the general principles, not really in conflict with Christianity, I would say. I mean, hatred is never appeased by hatred, it's appeased by love. Sounds a whole lot like you've heard it said, you should love your friend and hate your enemy, but I say love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. It's not very different. That we're supposed to find ways to love one another. And the Dalai Lama would even say today, actually I was just watching an interview and kind of studying for this, where he talked about, he was actually speaking at a Catholic church in New York. It was around his 80th birthday. And he went and he spoke at a Catholic church. And he said, essentially, it's like, I don't have any problem with Christianity, because in Christianity, the main ideal is that you're moving towards love, and love for one another, and love for God, and love for all of these things. Like, yeah, that's great. We should all be moving towards love. Like, that's what I believe also, is that we're supposed to, that's the greatest realization we can have, is love for one another. So while we would have some ideas and some concepts of that God is love, and that's why we worship the way that we do, and we believe in the person of Jesus Christ, there's some tenets that really tie into one another, and that aren't, like evil, terrible things. But this is not a bad way of looking at it. There's way worse ways to look at the world than that, right? So that's a little bit of Buddhism. There's a 10,000-foot view of a centuries-old religion that is way more complex and is followed by billions of people. But I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. Questions on Buddhism. Things I left out that I didn't talk about that you wish I did. With what? No. The growth rate has not slowed. If anything, a lot of these ideas are being picked up in Western culture, and I would say that there is even though they don't necessarily practice in large part the idea of deities, there's like this agnostic Buddhism that is kind of on the rise of more and more people saying, yeah, I like these ideas. And so there's kind of the growth of this this form of this. Now, in Tibet specifically, it kind of depends on how you measure it. There used to be hundreds of Tibetan monasteries and temples, they're down to a couple dozen, because many have been destroyed. So some people aren't practicing their faith in that way outright. But no, there's still quite a growth in Buddhism, especially as the numbers of people who just in their cultures practice Buddhism are continuing to grow, right? So, other questions? Yep. There's some good, yeah. There's some good documentaries out there. One that I watched on YouTube. It's just on YouTube, and it's called "The Last Dalai Lama," and so it's kind of the question of like, is this the last Dalai Lama? And but it talks a lot about him and his travels to New York and all of this kind of stuff, and just kind of where he's at now and what's going on and all those kind of things. And he was in some controversy not too long ago. Because he's a little creepy. So, I don't know. Old guy religious leaders, that happens. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Hmm. Okay. The Dalai Lama and some monks came to Finley or something like that. I feel like I kind of remember that. Yeah. 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 So it's interesting for a lot of them. So, um, especially in that particular branch of Buddhism, a big part of it is um, not living above your means, and so they're always like kind of handout asking for money or donations or something like that, and it's not because they're like trying to get rich off it. It's like this is just like I think as a part of my faith, I'm not supposed to take a salary. I'm not supposed to do anything. And for you, as a common person, a great way to earn some karma is to give a monk some money. And so there's always like a lot. It's good for everybody. We're going to do it this way. Yeah, so interesting. Other questions? All right. I'm going to pray for us, and we'll head out. Then I'm going to head downstairs. So I'm probably not going to stick around a whole lot. But next week, last one, come bring your questions. If there's anything in particular we haven't talked about yet this week, like, man, I wish we would cover that, send me an email, and I promise we'll spend at least 10 minutes on it, okay? So whatever you guys want. All right, God, thank you so much for this time together. Thank you so much that we're not the only ones that know that it's a good thing to love our enemies and to love our neighbors. That even in the searching of people from other places and other parts of the world and other cultures, that there's something about love that is shining through all of creation. And that your beauty and your truth that shines through all of it. And we appreciate that and we love that. You are a good God. Help us as we continue to go out into the world to love our neighbors and to be people who are people of peace and people who never believe that hatred is appeased by hatred, but it's appeased by love. That's a good thing. And we can all agree on that. God, we love you. We praise you. Pray you'd watch over us. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody.